I want to propose an alternative analogy. The crisis of democracy may be less like global warming and more like an earthquake. Like with an earthquake, there may be deep and real fault lines that erupt from time to time. But democratic crises, perhaps, like earthquakes, tend to come and go. And the biggest challenge is to get through the earthquake with our institutions intact. We have to make sure our institutions are built strong enough both to get through the earthquake and to have around after the earthquake. To do this, we cannot take our institutions for granted. We cannot attack our institutions by playing constitutional hardball. There's simply too much at stake.
I'm excited to hear from Dr. Ziblatt and from all of our panelists. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ziblatt to the podium.
Thank you very much, President Kelly, for the very kind introduction, also for the invitation to be here at this forum. I'm really, your words about inclusion and the role of universities in that is so, I take this very seriously, and I think it's great to have open discussions like this. I mean, one of the most exciting things about having written this book, usually you, as a political scientist, you write a book, and a couple of people read it, but being able to come out to public forums like this and talk to people about issues that a lot of people are thinking about and feel strongly about has just been really important, has restored some of my faith in democracy, I have to say. So with that very positive intro, I need to begin with some positive news because a lot of the talk is negative. So it's really wonderful to be here, to have a chance to talk about a question that I'll have to be honest with you, I didn't ever think, and my co-author as well, Steve Levitsky, neither of us ever thought we would be asking. And that is the question, could American democracy genuinely be in danger? Now, like most Americans, I think, my co-author and I both really took the stability of American democracy for granted. And there was actually really quite good reason for that. No democracy remotely as old as the United States is, or as rich as the United States is, has ever broken down. I mean, that's just a kind of simple fact. And yet, President Trump's election and the past 1.5 years of his presidency have seemed to place us really in uncharted territory. I think a lot of people have that feeling. Now, in his classic 1978 book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, Spanish political scientist Juan Linz, who was a political scientist for many years at Yale, he devised what he called a litmus test to identify authoritarian political leaders before they get into office. And we actually present a slightly revised version of that in our book, this litmus test to identify authoritarians before they get into office. Seems like a good idea to do that. And it turns out, before assuming the presidency, candidate Trump tested unambiguously positive on that litmus test. I mean, he suggested he would not abide by the results of elections. He threatened legal action against critics in the media. He threatened to lock up his opponent, and he condoned and even encouraged violence. Now, so whatever one thinks of him, and there's a lot of debate, maybe he's just a traditional Republican who says outrageous things. What's clear in any case is that no major party presidential candidate in modern American history had behaved this way. But Steve and I, in looking around the world and other parts of the world and other times, had seen political leaders behave this way. So me and my work in Europe in the 1920s and 30s in Europe, and Steve, who specializes in the study of Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. So watching the campaign unfold over the course of 2015, 2016, we had this real feeling that we had seen this movie before, and we knew and felt that it usually didn't end well. So we decided we really needed to write a book on this and to study other democracies in crisis at other points in time in other regions of the world, to study how some democracies, having faced those crises, overcame those crises, and how democracies in other countries, having faced those crises, succumbed to those crises. And what lessons we could draw from all of that for the United States. So that's what we decided we wanted to do. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The title of the book is How Democracies Die, so how do democracies die? Well, the first point, I guess, is that democracies don't die like they used to. Democracies during the Cold War, 3/4 of democracies, democratic breakdowns during the Cold War, came in the form of military coups at the hands of men with guns, generals, tanks, airplanes flying overhead. Contemporary democracies die in much more subtle ways. They die not at the hands of generals, but instead of elected presidents and prime ministers, leaders who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert democracy. Democracies die constitutionally through elections, referenda, parliamentary rulings, judicial rulings. As a result, many citizens often aren't fully aware what is happening until it's too late. So in 2011, just to give you one example, Hugo Chavez, 2011 is 12 years after Hugo Chavez became president in Venezuela. A majority of Venezuelans, according to surveys, still believe they were living in a democracy. Similar dynamics are unfolding today in Turkey a decade after the AKP's rise to power, and in Hungary and Poland as well. So if democratic breakdown now begins at the ballot box, one of the keys to protecting democracy today is keeping extremists and demagogues, potential authoritarians, from getting elected in the first place. They have to be blocked from getting elected in the first place. And it's here actually where political parties play an absolutely critical role. We often don't think about political parties serving this function, but political parties are democracy's gatekeepers. Because they select candidates, in an often very invisible part of the democratic process, they have the power, political parties have the power, to keep extremists and demagogues out of office. It's when parties fail to play this gatekeeping role that democracy gets into trouble. So elected authoritarians, it turns out, rarely come into office on their own. They almost always get an assist or some help from mainstream political parties or politicians. So around the world, elected authoritarians often begin their careers as outsiders, business leaders, generals, sort of general rabble-rousers, not part of the political establishment. But seeing these sorts of figures on the horizon, mainstream politicians and parties often are tempted to strike a kind of Faustian bargain with the outsider. And out of miscalculation or opportunism, they align themselves with the outsider, hoping to tap into some of the energy of the outsider, and also in the belief that they can control the outsider. They have more experience, after all. But a key lesson of history is that this bargain often backfires. So, to give you one example, in Italy in the 1920s, Mussolini was really an outsider of the political system, was on the edges, fringes of the political system, liberal, but he had lots of enthusiastic support. Liberal Italian statesman Giovanni Giletti saw this energy on the far right and decided to include Mussolini's party on his party list at the parliamentary election time. This legitimated Mussolini. Within 2 years, Mussolini was in power and Giletti was long gone. In 1930s Germany, the leader of Germany's Conservative Party saw Hitler on the horizon, and this is the mainstream Conservative Party, and trying to attract some of the grassroots appeal of Hitler, issued joint proclamations with Hitler's party, held joint rallies, but this strategy helped to legitimate Hitler. And Hitler rose, and this party, the Conservative Party, fell apart. In early 1933, when conservative statesman Franz von Papen was trying to assuage the fears of his Conservative Party allies after they had appointed Hitler as chancellor in January 1933, he told them, he said, "Don't worry." This is a quote from von Papen. "Don't worry. Within 2 months, we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner, he'll squeal." A bigger miscalculation is harder to imagine. In both Italy and Germany, mainstream politicians driven by short-term ambitions abandoned their gatekeeping role and let extremists in the door. So this is a key way in which democracy has died historically. Now, by contrast to all of that, in the United States, political parties have done actually a pretty good job of gatekeeping. This is important because the United States has had no shortage of extremists and voters who would support extremists. And we tend to kind of whitewash our own history and forget that there's a whole cast of characters out there who are really quite popular. You think of in the 1930s, the Catholic priest, Father Coughlin, right-wing radio personality, who had tens of millions of listeners. Or in the 1920s, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, was a famous anti-Semite and was actually quoted positively by Hitler in the first edition of Mein Kampf and considered running for president in the 1920s. Huey Long in the 1930s, the autocratic governor and senator from Louisiana. In the 1950s, Joe McCarthy had big political ambitions. In the 1960s, George Wallace, the segregationist governor from Alabama, decided to run for president and tried to run for president. And remarkably, there's actually Gallup poll data going back to the 1930s asking favorability opinions of various politicians, and each of these figures garnered around 35% approval ratings in surveys, a number that's not so dissimilar, incidentally, from the support base of President Trump today. So here's the point. None of these figures, despite being very popular, made it close to the White House. Why not? And what has changed? How were they kept out? Well, we argue in our book that the way they were kept out was mostly through the presidential candidate selection process. So prior to 1972, American presidential candidates were selected in a system, so the first 3/4 of the 20th century were selected in a system that's often called a system of smoke-filled back rooms. At conventions, what would happen is party leaders would get together in hotels surrounding the convention hall, and in hotel rooms with lots of whiskey and lots of cigars, they would decide on the candidate. Now, the system certainly was not transparent, it was not inclusive, it was not democratic, but it was an effective filtration system. Party leaders served as gatekeepers. They engaged in what political scientists at the time described as a system of peer review. And by that, what political scientists meant was that the party leaders who had worked up close with potential candidates had seen them in moments of crisis, had seen them in moments of triumph. They knew which of them also were potential demagogues. And so for all of its shortcomings, and I would not argue to go back to the age of smoke-filled back rooms, the old convention system actually had a pretty good record, basically a perfect record in keeping demagogues off the top of party lists. Under the old convention system, it was actually impossible for an outsider like Henry Ford or a demagogue like Huey Long to be nominated by a major party. So most of them didn't even try. Curious how many of you have read Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America, the 2004 novel. I highly recommend it. It's a work of fiction. It came out in 2004, kind of counterfactual history inspired by real events in which the celebrity airplane pilot Charles Lindbergh, who in fact was something of a Nazi sympathizer, and the fictional part of the story is he captures the 1940 Republican nomination and goes on to beat FDR, and everything goes downhill from there. This story seems all too imaginable today. I mean, in fact, that's partly what the sales boosted after 2016. But back in 1940, it was actually unthinkable. Lindbergh's candidacy would have never made it out of the smoke-filled back rooms. It would have never made it past the party gatekeepers. So what happened in 2016? Well, in our book, we argue two big things happened. First, American political parties adopted a system of binding primaries starting in 1972. They adopted a system of binding primaries. So the binding primaries is the system we're all familiar with today. Is far more open than the old convention system, but it also weakened party leaders' role as gatekeepers. So now if a demagogue like Huey Long or Charles Lindbergh were to run for office, it would be much harder to keep him out. And that's what we saw in 2016. I mean, one way to think about this is that Donald Trump was the kind of Henry Ford of his day. But whereas party gatekeepers had kept Ford far from the presidency, Trump found the gates wide open. The Democrats experienced something, of course, slightly different. They also opened the door, but they introduced a system of superdelegates, which served as a kind of check in some ways on the open system. But the Republicans, of course, never adopted a system of superdelegates. Okay, so that's one part of the story. That's not the end of the story. The second part of the story is Republican gatekeepers, I would argue, failed a second time. One of the key lessons that Juan Linz and other political scientists who study this make is that looking at interwar Europe is when somebody emerges on the scene who you think might be potentially a threat to democracy, mainstream parties must do everything possible while still abiding by the rules of democracy to keep them far from power. Of course, resisting a demagogue on one's own side is difficult. It risks angering the base. It often means short-term political defeat. And politicians often tell themselves and rationalize that, well, maybe the person won't be so bad. Maybe we can get our agenda through. And so you don't want to hand power over to your ideological rivals. Actually, in Brazil today, we're seeing, after the first round of the presidential elections, a very similar dynamic unfold where elected leaders have to decide, are they going to support Bolsonaro, a right-wing former general who's running for president, or a left-wing party that's reputation's been ruined through corruption. I mean, it's not a great choice. But Linz made this point forcefully, and so I want to quote him. What Juan Linz wrote, writing in the 1970s, he said, when faced with would-be authoritarians, he wrote, politicians must join with opponents ideologically distant, but committed to the survival of the democratic order. So Republican leaders didn't like Donald Trump very much during the election. They thought he was a demagogue. I mean, a lot of them said as much. They thought he might be unfit for office. Yet they did not do what Linz would have recommended, which is to join forces with the other side. Now, one might think that was unrealistic to expect, but it's clear lots of leading politicians on the Republican Party, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, didn't particularly like Trump, but they all endorsed him. Bush remained silent. This sent a crucial signal to Republican voters. It told Republicans that this was essentially a normal election, and a normal election between two parties can go either way. In the context of an uneven economy, standard two-party race can go either way, and that's what happened. It happened to go the way of Trump. Now, just in case you think it's not realistic to have expected this to happen, this kind of crossing party lines, there's something similar that happened in France in the 2017 presidential election, where you also have a two-round presidential election, where Francois Fillon, who was France's Republican Party candidate, didn't make it to the second round. In the second round, then was Macron, a former minister in a socialist government, and Marine Le Pen. Fillon could have remained silent. He could have endorsed Le Pen, but instead he endorsed Macron. And there's some evidence to suggest this made quite a bit of difference. In the United States, this did not happen. And again, I would argue, and we can debate this, that somebody with authoritarian tendencies, or at least a weak, demonstrable commitment to democratic norms, is in a powerful office. Once they're in the door, it's a changed game. So now, for the first time, arguably, in modern American history, there is a president in the office beginning in 2017 who unleashed this kind of firestorm because of a perception that he was not committed to democratic norms. And we've seen the resulting tumult over the last year and a half. Now, this is where actually political institutions really come in to play a major role, because Americans tend to place a lot of faith in our Constitution. We have the oldest and most successful written Constitution in the world, and our system of checks and balances has, in fact, contained many powerful and ambitious presidents. You can think of Andrew Jackson, you can think of FDR and his effort at core packing, you can think of Richard Nixon. So if it contained these guys, why shouldn't it contain President Trump? It might, and perhaps in fact it has. But one of the core messages of our book is that the Constitution by itself is not enough to save democracy. Constitutions aren't self-enacting. They don't just work automatically. If they did, a country like Argentina, a country that my co-author knows quite a bit about and has spent a lot of time studying, Argentina adopted essentially an identical constitution to our own. 2/3 of its text in the 19th century was taken from the American Constitution. And yet, Argentina suffered 6 military coups over the course of the 20th century. So the point is, the words on the page are not the only thing that matters. They matter, but that's not the only thing that matters. Constitutions work best when they're reinforced by unwritten rules or norms. And our book focuses on two norms in particular that I think are really critical for the survival of democracies. The first we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of your partisan opponents. This means no matter how much you disagree with, or even dislike viscerally your opponent, you treat them with respect, and they have the legitimacy to at least compete for office and to govern. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemy. The second norm is what we call institutional forbearance. Now, forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It's an act of self-restraint, an self-conscious underutilization of one's power. So why does this matter so much? Well, think about what the president can constitutionally do under the law in the United States. The president, under the Constitution, can pardon whoever he or she wants, whenever he or she wants. Any president with a congressional majority can pack the Supreme Court. If you don't like how the Supreme Court is ruling, expand it to 11, expand it to 13. It's perfectly legal. Or if a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, you can circumvent this through executive order, and we've seen lots of this recently. The Constitution doesn't prohibit such action. Or think about what Congress can do. The Senate can use its right of advise and consent to block any cabinet appointment of a president, or any court appointment of a president, of a Supreme Court vacancy. And of course, the Congress can impeach the president on any grounds it thinks count as high crimes and misdemeanor. The House of Representatives, all it needs to pass an indictment is 50%. It's pretty easy to get that. So the point here is that politicians can exploit the letter of the law. All of these things are legal in ways that eviscerate the spirit of the law. Legal scholar at Harvard, Mark Tushnet, calls this form of behavior constitutional hardball. If you look at any failing or failed democracy around the world, at any point in time, you'll see an abundance of constitutional hardball. Argentina under Perón, Spain and Germany in the 1930s, Venezuela under Chavez, contemporary Hungary, Poland, and Turkey. Constitutional hardball is how even brilliantly designed constitutions, systems of checks and balances get subverted. It's how legislative and judicial watchdog institutions turn into lapdog institutions. So what's critical then is what prevents a system of checks and balances from descending into constitutional hardball that can wreck a democracy is forbearance. It's the unwritten but shared commitment of exercising restraint and deploying one's prerogatives, rooted in a commitment to the spirit of the law. Just to give you another example, if you think about presidential term limits historically in the United States, prior to 1951, of course, the U.S. Constitution placed no limits, legal limits, written legal limits on running for re-election. So U.S. presidents could be president for life. Yet George Washington, of course, famously stepped down after 2 terms, and for nearly 150 years, no president even ever sought a 3rd term. Ulysses S. Grant, Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, very ambitious politicians, could have done this, but it was an unwritten rule of self-restraint that they did not do this. Or take the filibuster. Technically, the filibuster, a Senate minority can use the filibuster to block every single piece of legislation. But historically, the filibuster was rarely used in the United States. It was used as an instrument of last resort. So between 1917 and 1960, there were only 30 filibusters, fewer than 1 a year. Today, that number, of course, has exploded. So the point here is that norms of mutual toleration and forbearance serve as the soft guardrails of democracy. They prevent healthy political competition from degenerating into political deadlock and partisan fights to the death that have wrecked democracies in other parts of the world in other points in time. Now, American democracy hasn't always had these soft guardrails. It didn't have them in the early years of the Republic. It certainly didn't have them during the Civil War and in the aftermath of the Civil War. Constitutional hardball was abundant in the 1960s and the 1970s. Both sides viewed each other as existential enemies. An impeachment of a president was launched. Supreme Court nominees were blocked. Supreme Court size was expanded. But for very tragic reasons that we discuss in our book, beginning in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans began to accept one another as basically legitimate and avoided then, as a result of this, destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. In particular, what prompted this was that the Republican Party gave up on the reconstruction of the U.S. South, in effect, giving up on the cause of racial equality. Southern Democrats no longer viewed Northern Republicans as an existential threat. So a kind of tragic truce was achieved, mutual toleration was restored, forbearance reemerged, but a great tragic irony that we continue to live with today is that our norms of mutual toleration and forbearance that are preconditions for democracy, ironically, were achieved at the price of racial exclusion. So in this sense, our democracy was fundamentally incomplete, but constitutional hardball was now diminished. There were during the course of the 20th century, there were no impeachments or successful court packings. Senators were judicious and sparing in their use of the filibuster. And outside of wartime, presidents refrained for the first part of the 20th century from acting unilaterally to circumvent courts and Congress. For more than a century, in short, our checks and balances worked, but they worked not just because of the words on the page, but because they were reinforced by these 2 norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. Now, as we show in our book, these norms have been unraveling over the course of the last 25 years. We've seen this accelerate in the past 2 years, arguably, I think, on both sides, but it's important to recognize the decline of mutual toleration and forbearance that we witness today preceded long before Donald Trump. It began, really, we make the case, in the 1990s with Newt Gingrich, who became Republican House Speaker in 1995. Beginning when he ran for Speaker, became Speaker, he instructed his Republican Party allies to use terms like betray and anti-flag, anti-family, traitor to describe Democrats. Gingrich was a master also of constitutional hardball. He engineered the first government shutdown in 1995. 3 years later, the Republican House carried out a mostly partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton. It was the first presidential impeachment in 130 years. So this process of norm erosion, though, really took off in the 2000s. During the Obama era, the Tea Party movement radicalized the Republican Party, encouraging them to abandon mutual toleration. Republican leaders began to say that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and Democrats weren't real Americans. The birther movement went a step further, questioning whether President Obama even had a right to be president if he was not born in the United States. Let me just give you one example. Colorado Congressman Mike Coffman declared, for example, in the mid-2000s, I don't know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this. In his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American. Hillary Clinton received similar treatment. So, as I've noted, America has always had a kind of extremist fringe, but this was definitely not fringe politics. These were all now increasingly national political leaders. Leading Republicans were increasingly denying the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. This was particularly worrying because in the absence of mutual toleration, politicians, in effect, if you regard your rivals as existential threats, as enemies, politicians are tempted to abandon forbearance. They're tempted to engage in an escalating spiral of constitutional hardball. When we view our partisan rivals as enemies, when we view them as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. And this is what was beginning to happen in the 2000s. Politicians increasingly threw forbearance to the wind. So when Republicans won the control of Congress in 2010, they decided to block anything that President Obama was proposing. Filibuster use, which had already been rising for decades at the hands of both Democrats and Republicans, reached an all-time high. There was actually more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in all of the years between World War I and the end of the Reagan presidency combined. I mean, that's a striking figure. President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform or climate change legislation, he simply circumvented Congress and made policy by executive order. That action was technically legal, but again, it clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. By the end of the Obama presidency, Republicans, increasingly at the state level as well, began to use more extreme measures. 15 states, all Republican-led, adopted strict voter ID laws. In North Carolina in 2016, after the Democrats won the governorship in 2000, the Republican legislature held a surprise special session in which they passed laws weakening the new Democratic government. They packed local election boards, they granted nearly 1,000 Republican-appointed officials tenure in the state government, and they reduced the size of the court. Most stunning of all, though, in my mind, and this has come up in the last several weeks, was the U.S. Senate's 2016 decision to not allow President Obama to fill the vacancy prompted by Justice Scalia's death. This move was unprecedented, to not even hold hearings since 1866. Now, all of this, though, I want to make the point, was before Donald Trump was elected president. So the problem is not just that Americans have elected somebody with at best a weak commitment to democratic norms. It's that we've elected a demagogue when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy have begun to erode. Okay, so the question you might be asking now is, why in the hell is this all happening? Why is this happening? Sorry, I tried to check myself. That was inappropriate. Well, we argue in our book that what's driving all of this, lots of things are driving this, but what's the kind of major factor driving this norm erosion is polarization. Republicans and Democrats have come to fear and loathe each other. In 1960, 5% of Republicans said they would be displeased if their child married a Democrat. Today, that number is 50%. We have similar numbers on the other side as well. According to a recent Pew survey, 45% of Republicans and 41% of Democrats say the other parties' policies threaten the nation's well-being. 49% of Democrats, 49% of Republicans, 55% of Democrats say that the other party makes them afraid. We've not seen this kind of partisan hatred since the late 19th century. And this isn't just traditional liberal conservative polarization. People don't fear and loathe each other over taxes and healthcare. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. Our parties have changed dramatically in many ways over the last 50 years. In the 1960s and 1970s, Republicans and Democratic, the party leadership, were culturally actually quite similar. There was huge policy differences, of course, but demographically, the party's leadership were overwhelmingly white and Christian. 3 major changes have taken place over the last half century. First, the civil rights movement and the achievement of full civil rights and voting rights for all Americans in the 1960s led to a massive and gradual migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, and leading many African Americans to the Democratic Party. Second, the U.S. experienced, after major policy changes, a massive wave of migration beginning in the 1960s, and most of these immigrants ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, by the time of the Reagan era, Christian evangelicals who had previously been split remarkably evenly between the Republican and Democratic Party were predominantly in the Republican Party. So today, Democrats and Republicans are racially and culturally distinct. The Democrats are mostly a kind of rainbow coalition of urban and educated whites, and the Republican Party, by contrast, remains overwhelmingly white and Christian. Now, this is important because white Christians aren't just any group. They were once the majority, and they used to sit unchallenged atop this country's social, economic, cultural, and political hierarchies. They filled the presidency, the Congress, the governor's mansions. They were the pillars of local communities. They were the CEOs, the newscasters, the movie stars, the college professors. They were the faces, crucially, both of the Republican and the Democratic Party. Those days are long gone. But losing a majority and losing one's social status can be deeply threatening. Many Republicans feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away. And this, we think, is ultimately what's driving polarization. The problem is that extreme polarization can kill democracies. This is a major lesson from 1960s, 70s Latin America and 1930s Europe. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views a victory by the other side as intolerable, as beyond the pale, democracy is in trouble. When an opposition victory becomes intolerable, you of course start to rely on desperate measures, justify using extraordinary means. In other places, this has meant coups, violence, election fraud. Of course, this hasn't happened in the United States, but we have reached a point in the United States where, according to 2016 presidential exit polls, 1 in 4 Trump voters believed he was unfit for office. 1 in 4 Trump voters believed he was unfit for office, yet they still preferred him to the Democratic candidate. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup, Republicans have a more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than they do of Hillary Clinton. These are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of this polarization. He's not just a cause of it. And his departure won't put an end to it. Okay, so what can be done? No idea. But in the spirit of the Ford Hall Forum and looking forward, I'm going to propose a couple of ideas, and I hope to discuss this. Hope we can have a nice discussion. So I'll be ending with a couple of points here. First, it's clear the Republican Party itself needs to transform itself. It has to become a more diverse party. As long as it remains at the national level, an overwhelmingly white Christian party in a country as diverse as the United States, it's always going to be tempted. It's often going to be tempted to use polarizing white nationalist kind of extremism. Okay, so that's one thing. What can Democrats do? Now, there's been a lot of talk, really, especially in the last several weeks, but even preceding that, in progressive circles, of the idea that Democrats need to learn to fight like Republicans. If Republicans are going to play constitutional hardball, the argument runs, then Democrats need to play tit for tat. If they don't, they'll be this victim of an endless series of sucker punches, stolen Supreme Court seats and the like. A recent book has come out by a political scientist titled, "It's Time to Fight Dirty." And the formula goes something like this. Impeachment should be pursued no matter what. There has been, if the Democrats retake the Senate, there should be pushed, and actually I just saw a recent column by E.J. Dionne making this case as well, that there needs to be a push to increase the size of the Supreme Court, as Franklin Roosevelt did, if Democrats retake the Senate and the presidency. If Democrats retake the House and the Senate, begin impeachment hearings on Republican judges. Now, the appeal of these sorts of constitutional hardball strategies is really understandable. And in many ways, they are becoming an increasingly dominant perspective amongst elements of the Democratic Party. And it's also a response that I can frankly understand, but it also worries me and my co-author. It's really another turn in the spiral. If Democrats respond with constitutional hardball, it will most certainly reinforce and even accelerate the process of norm erosion. In other words, it will further corrode our democratic guardrails. In our experience, having looked at other countries around the world and looking at other democracies in crisis around the world, this sort of escalation rarely ends well. Now, I understand elected leaders, elected Democrats in particular, are under enormous pressure to fight hard. And many ask, why should Democrats engage in kind of unilateral disarmament? If the other side's breaking the rules, why shouldn't we? Again, I understand the pressure that elected officials feel, but I think there's actually two points, and these will be my last 2 points. First, we believe that Democrats actually face an incentive to preserve democratic norms, even if it means playing a sucker in the short run. So in his book, Trumpocracy, by Republican speechwriter and analyst David Frum, he argues that the Republican Party today is operating with incredibly short time horizons. As it's currently constituted, Frum argues, with long-run demographic shifts on the horizon, the Republican Party is going to have a hard time winning in the medium term and the long term. And so, in fact, according to Frum, these kind of hardball tactics that I've talked about, vote rigging, locking advantages in the court, norm breaking, these are kind of a desperate effort, according to Frum, to preserve as much power as possible, given this medium run and long run, these poor prospects in the medium run and the long run. Democrats, by contrast, have much better medium-term prospects. So the greatest threat to Democrats' prospects is escalating this conflict that puts these very institutions at risk. So for Democrats, to preserve the democratic game is in the Democrats' enlightened self-interest. Fighting dirty might play better with the base, but it's a strategy that I think ultimately is more dangerous. So, the broader point I guess I'd like to suggest, and I'll end with this, is when we talk about the crisis of democracy, how endangered are our democracies, there's often a sense that the crisis of democracy is something like global warming. I used to say that, that it's a crisis that's off in the future, but as we've seen in recent reports, 10, 20, 30 years. But the similarity is the crisis of democracy is something in which things are only getting worse. That there's rising tides of disaffection, dissatisfaction, dysfunction. And unless we take desperate new measures, we're in a brave new world where the old rules don't apply, unless we take dramatic measures to halt this rising tide of democratic crisis, then we're doomed. So that's one analogy. Global warming. I want to propose an alternative analogy. The crisis of democracy may be less like global warming and more like an earthquake. Like with an earthquake, there may be deep and real fault lines that erupt from time to time. But democratic crises, perhaps, like earthquakes, tend to come and go. And the biggest challenge is to get through the earthquake with our institutions intact. We have to make sure our institutions are built strong enough both to get through the earthquake and to have around after the earthquake. To do this, we cannot take our institutions for granted. We cannot attack our institutions by playing constitutional hardball. There's simply too much at stake. Thank you.
The forum is about discussions, and as you have heard, I think this is an important book for very serious times. As you can tell also, I'm from a different country. I'm from Spain. And I had, I guess, the misfortune to grow up in a country in which we had an authoritarian regime. So I know firsthand what living under a dictatorship means. I don't need to read about it in the books or to discuss it in hypothetical terms. And it is profoundly discouraging to see what is happening in so many countries all over the world. A lot of the focus was about Trump. But when you think about what is happening in Europe, in Latin America, and many Asian countries, I think that this question has become a global question. And to discuss it, we have a great panel. President Kelly introduced them before. I'm not going to introduce them again. I want to start very quickly the discussion. The format is going to be the following. I'm going to ask them 4 questions to start the discussion. Then Dr. Ziblatt will join the panel, and we will open up to the audience. We're going to be passing now small cards to all of you with pencils. You will be asked to write your questions. We will collect those questions, and then I will select those questions and post them for the panel. So I encourage, please, those of you who are interested in asking questions, please write them down in the cards in a way in which hopefully I can read them, please. So I want to start just quickly with a general question for the 4 panelists about the book. And I would like to ask them if they can comment and react to the books and to the comments from Dr. Ziblatt. You want to start, Richard?
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Provost. Wonderful presentation, just a wonderful presentation, and great summary of the book, and then some go forward. So if you like the presentation, you'll love the book as I did, so congratulations. Want to add a couple of things, though, which I think is worth thinking about as we look at democracy, particularly in the United States. We are now beginning to have a situation where candidates become president who do not have the largest popular vote. They win the Electoral College, but do not have the largest popular vote. And I think there's a strong case for an erosion in public confidence in our presidential election. I think that's one point that I think needs to be further discussed. Secondly, I also believe the role of the press is very important to consider. On the one hand, it is a distinguishing factor between our country and many of the other countries that you reference in your book and how their countries respond to democracy. But on the other hand, I think in a couple of cases, I'm growing increasingly uncomfortable with this notion that major networks are left or right. So you're watching CNN or MSNBC or Fox, and you walk into a room, a bar, a restaurant, or a public place, and as soon as you see one on the dial, you say, well, I don't belong here, or I do belong here. Seems to me they need to be balanced. Secondarily, with respect to the press, I think they were duped by candidate Trump. I can recall when Donald Trump called into Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski every day because it was entertaining, it was fun. They had no idea that they were giving credibility, institutional credibility, to his candidacy. I also think the notion of change elections need to be discussed. There are times in our history when America wants a change. I think President Obama, Candidate Obama, tapped into it, and candidate Trump definitely tapped into it. And then I'll just make one other point and be quiet. Your reference to prior years when backroom dealings made the candidate the candidate. I would suggest that the Democratic Party tried that this time. Donna Brazil's book, subsequent information from former DNC chair Congresswoman Deborah Wasserman Schultz, suggested that they were going to inaugurate candidate Clinton regardless. And it became public, it backfired, she resigned. More importantly, though, Bernie Sanders now believes it's his turn because he was blocked out last time. So, great book. These are some things I think would be part of the conversation going forward.
Thank you, Richard. Brian.
Okay. Yes. Well, yes, again, thank you for inviting me to this panel. Yeah, I think actually I was fascinated by the book. I think one of the things that Professor Ziblatt talked about was that, you write a book as a political scientist and only 2 or 3 people outside your family read it. But this is a book that...
Family, lucky you.
I know. I know. But this is an example of a book that actually, as I was reading through it, I was recommending to people all the time. Like, this is a great political science book. This is an example of good political science. It's accessible. It talks about an issue that's contemporary, that's relevant, that's pressing. And I think that's the thing about it. I would describe the book as useful because what it does is it provides an analytical framework in this idea of the litmus test that you described from Lintz's work and others of what is the nature of an authoritarian or an elected authoritarian or a demagogue. So what you do is they're treating Trump as a case. And I think that's quite important. So it's not just, they're treating a comparative analysis and they're looking at Trump as a case that you can then apply this framework to. And why I think this is quite useful is because let's all admit it. Ever since Trump descended the escalator in June 2016, he's defied comprehension in a way. I mean, it's like in the book they talk about the invisible primary. He didn't get any endorsements. Then he just wins in the primaries. At every point, talking to students, talking to other people, observers, they just thought, at what point will this guy just implode, or like a number of other marginal candidates have done on both sides? So that's the thing. But he didn't, right? And he gets through the invisible. He gets through the primary. Gets through the general election. Actually gets elected. And so I think that's the thing that's fascinating about this book, and I'd recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it yet. That it provides a framework for understanding Trump specifically, and in addition to that, all these broader trends like polarization, and as they describe it, the great unraveling that's happened in contemporary U.S. politics.
Thank you, Brian. Renee?
So I also join in the other panelists in thanking you for the opportunity to comment on this book, and I agree with the comments that have been made so far. I think that Richard's point about how there are some structural changes that are not addressed in the book about our democracy that are perhaps worthy of consideration, and I'll allude to one of them in a few thoughts that I wrote down beforehand. I also agree that with Brian that this book really does a very fine job of documenting the historical record of how autocrats came to power and the kinds of events that the public should be aware of and be watchful for in the democracy, so that we are not surprised by the what happens when we elect people who reflect these characteristics. So I think that is a very, very useful service of the book, and I agree with all the comments about how its readability and accessibility, and I congratulate him on having all these people read the book. It's wonderful in that regard. One of the sentences in the book that I found that I think reflects really how we should be thinking about this problem in our democracy right now is that Professor Ziblatt quotes a North Carolina Congressman, David Price, who's a Democrat from Chapel Hill, and Price says, "American democracy may be more fragile than we realized." And I always think about this, that if you think about the events in the world, what's happened in some of the other countries that Professor Ziblatt and Levitsky talk about in the book, countries like Turkey, more recently Hungary, Poland, that everything seemed to be going along just fine, and then one day you wake up and things are not fine anymore. And so it's one of those things that we must constantly be vigilant about what's happening in the political culture and what's happening in the society. I think that because the book is written by two political scientists, there's less emphasis in some ways on the role of the courts in helping to construct this problem, although they do refer to it. I'm not saying they ignore this issue completely, but if you think about the role that they discuss in the book of external groups having a very big impact on the political process, external unelected groups that have their own agendas, and I think about the role of the courts. I think about how in the last 20 years or so, the Federalist Society has really taken over the process of putting forward nominees acceptable for judicial appointments by Republican presidents. President Trump openly acknowledges that he is operating from the Federalist Society list every time he makes an appointment, especially at the Court of Appeals or certainly at the Supreme Court level. Our newest justice, Justice Kavanaugh, refused to admit that he was a product of this system, even though the president has bragged about it. And indeed, the Washington Post today reports that the leading candidate to replace Justice Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit is Naomi Rao, who's the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, the Office of Management and Budget. She was instrumental in getting George Mason Law School named after Justice Scalia after his death. So she's long been operating in this orbit, so it's going to continue on. The decision by the Supreme Court to take and decide the Bush v. Gore case, essentially putting its thumb on the scale in a presidential election, when there is a constitutional mechanism for resolving these disputed elections, was very significant in sort of contributing to the problem that's been analyzed. The Citizens United case, which overturned limits on money in politics, and there have been other cases that have done so. There are a series of decisions undermining consumer protections and employment rights by upholding required arbitration policies and employment agreements in companies. And then last term's decision undermining public sector unions is another weakening of the ability of kind of ordinary people to function and to assert their rights in a whole variety of contexts. I think that, and then I could go on at length, and I won't take too much more time with this, but some of the decisions of the Supreme Court have taken a page from the late 19th century and early 20th century courts of undermining voting and other kinds of rights by pretending not to understand the implications of gerrymandering decisions or voter regulations that really have an effect on the ability of people to exercise their right to vote. There are some counterexamples too, though, so in a way I'll end up on this optimistic note as well, that I think that Chief Justice Roberts, even though I disagree with him about a lot of things, I think he really do care about the institutional legitimacy of the Supreme Court. I think that his votes that were essential in upholding the Affordable Care Act and two decisions that the court made, the first one, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, and then the challenge to the tax subsidies for purchases on the exchanges. Those two votes really were a signal that the Congress passed a law, and let's let the executive and the Congress work with the law and the public benefit from it. And so I think that, that to the extent that Chief Justice Roberts has his eye on that long ball, that there might be some hope that there is that there will be concern for the institutional legitimacy of our government institutions. I'll say two other points that are just about me and my connection to some of these issues. So I was working in the Clinton administration during the two government shutdowns in the 1990s. And during the second one, which was longer, somehow the head of my unit in the Department of Justice got us all declared to be essential employees. So we came back. Well, what was our essential work? We were working on vetting and screening judges, right, for federal judicial appointments. That's when some of the problems began to really become significant in terms of Republicans and the Congress not being willing to approve judicial appointments by Democratic presidents. And I'm not saying that the reverse hasn't also been true at times. And then one final thing, going back to Richard's point about structural considerations. One of the things to think about is how to depoliticize at least the appointments process for the Supreme Court, which seems to be the one that causes the most consternation in the system. And there's a lot of discussion about perhaps having a very long terms, but term limits, 18 years, so that there isn't this game played of, what's the youngest person that you can possibly get through the Senate, to be on the court, to have your legacy cemented forever, and to also give every president the opportunity to appoint justices to the court, so that it's not, some sort of random event in the biosphere that, Justice Scalia's death, someone resigning unexpectedly, that gives the opportunity for a president to appoint a Supreme Court justice.
Thank you, Renee. Greg?
Thank you, Sebastian, and thank you, Dan, for this book. It is an encouragement to know that it is a New York Times bestseller. I think that shows something about the hunger in the country to understand what's going on now. There's so much I could talk about and would like to talk about in this book, and if you haven't read it, I really encourage you to read it. I'm a political philosopher, so let me begin with that, and a quote towards the end of the book from your colleague Danielle Allen, who wrote that the simple fact of the matter is that the world has never built a multi-ethnic democracy in which no particular ethnic group is in the majority, and where political equality, social equality, and economies that empower all have been achieved. So one thing I think we need to remember about the American Republic is that I'm not sure it's unique in this way, but it is highly unusual in being founded in philosophical ideas. And those ideas are represented in our Declaration of Independence, in the formation of the Constitution, and other documents that are part of, I think, what you were calling the unwritten Constitution, that set norms for what the expectation, broadly speaking, is of our republic. But something else that your book brings out, you also talked about it today, is what can only be described as the original sin of that republic. Our Constitution begins, "We the people." But who is that people? Who is that we? And we know that racism and slavery were ground into the bones of the republic in the larger sense than just its constitution from the beginning. And as your book shows, that has been part of the dynamic of this country's politics ever since, even when it was functioning well. It functioned well because it set to the side the question of who that we included. So in the period between the end of Reconstruction until the Civil Rights Movement, Democrats and Republicans had a kind of truce on this issue, but that was at the price of excluding people of color from the full promise of all men are created equal. All persons are created equal, really, right? So John Locke, who was one of the most influential thinkers in the period before the founding, on the founding generation, his view was that you can't really have a political community that isn't a single body politic, that the body politic, that the we precedes the constitutional form that the we then gives itself. So that is our problem as a nation, is that we have not yet come to grips with the fractured we that we are, and really tried to solve that problem. And it's because that problem lies underneath the surface that different political movements can lay hold of it and manipulate it. And in this case, I fear that it's part of the unraveling of our democratic polity at this time when the previous white Christian America, which had been used to being on the top of the pile and unquestioned in that role, now feels that this is the last chance, and Trump is their avatar. So that's what really frightens me now. And so the question of a solution has to be a solution that also addresses the fractured we in a way that, you know, we had the revolution, we could have done it then. We had the Civil War, we didn't do it then. We had the Civil Rights Movement. That didn't lock it in, because now we have the Southern strategy that brought us Donald Trump. So something has got to be done about that. And I'm not sure what it is. It might be some of the suggestions you have about electoral policies that would appeal across the divides, but it's been going for 230 years. I don't know what'll break it. This pathology we have.
Thank you, Greg. I want to build on that comment about solutions. I mean, we've heard a lot about the problems and the sources of the situation that we find ourselves today in. Dr. Ziblatt made the comment about the situation that we live almost in which Democrats and Republicans feel that this is a crisis, almost an existential threat. Every time that the Republicans lose, they feel that the Democrats are going to finish with everything that they consider sacred, and the other way around. There's also people feeling, in the words of a sociologist that was here at Suffolk a few months ago, Dr. Rothschild, that mentioned that they refer to these people as strangers in their own land, how they don't find themselves in a situation that they recognize that this is the country they love and the country that they love in. So I'm interested in some ways in hearing your perspective about how do we get away from this situation? We see growing polarization, we see more and more anxiety, we see a situation in which many of the communities that existed in the past have broken down for the reasons that are discussed in the books. So I want to ask the panelists if they can comment on ways in which you think that we can address this polarization and this anxiety.
Well, I really strongly believe that the underpinning of our democracy is a strong two-party system. And we don't have that now. You really defined the makeup of each party. And I am troubled particularly with a system where the majority of one ethnic group belongs to the Democratic Party and is not balanced. So where do I come out on that? I think the Republican Party has to lose big. Not maybe for the reason you think, but the reason has to be that there has to be a conclusion at the leadership top that the Trump model does not work. And it only will happen if there's a real change wave. Then the party has to step back and say, what do we do now to regain the confidence and get back into power? So having said that, you got to vote. As we used to say in South Boston, vote early and vote often. Vote as much as you can and resist every opportunity to restrict voting and empower every place to vote early. Registration, now we have early registration in Massachusetts. Get people registered, get young people, everybody in this room, particularly college students, register and vote. So that's number one. Number two, I honestly believe that the Republican Party will never regain the confidence of the traditional African American. That ship, I think, is gone. But there is the Caribbean community, the Latino community, the African community, and other immigrant communities who I do believe can believe that the real Republican Party, the old Republican Party, offers an opportunity, whether you're talking about small business, entrepreneurship, family focus, church focus. Those are some things that are attractive. So I know it sounds scary to have a two-party system, but we got to have one. We really got to have one, number one. And then number two, as I mentioned, voting. I'll raise one other issue, though, which I neglected to mention in my first response, which I think is important. You talked about the internal threats to democracy. The grave external threat, of course, is social media and the intervention of Russia and others in our election. So I am most concerned. Our institutions will come and go, and your book did a brilliant job of giving evidence where we've had trouble before. Dred Scott decision, Reconstruction, Civil War. We've had problems, and we've come out of them. But if we don't fix the external threat of social media and disruption in changing public opinion, I think we'll be in trouble. So those are my comments.
Okay. The thing is, polarization. Polarization is around to the extent to which it is because it works. Polarization works. What do I mean by that? You guys, we have a participation and enthusiasm crisis in the United States. People just don't participate in politics. The best description I heard of politics, and by the way, I always like people who hate politics, even though I study politics. I think they're the most fascinating. They told me that your politics is background noise. Politics is background noise. So the thing is this: the Republican Party has done this better than the Democratic Party, but I can tell you the Democratic Party would use the exact same strategy if it could figure out how. Is that polarization works for the Republican Party because it mobilizes people. That's why So this is I agree actually with Richard. The solution, and also with Professor Ziblatt, about parties. I'm a researcher of political parties, and I think they're important and they're vital. In fact, because they are really the mechanisms. Because, for example, you can say registration, but registration, we've seen this before. Motor voter bill, and registration means nothing. What a political party is, or used to be, is something that comes and grabs you by the collar and actually yanks you out to vote. And the thing about saying vote often, when you say vote early, when you vote often, what that means is it's not just, obviously it's illegal for you to vote more than once, right? But what it means is this, is that you get 50 people that you know are going to vote the same way as you to vote. And you don't mobilize 50 people who are going to vote against you. So political parties, that's what they do. Parties don't care about democracy; they care about winning. And so, I know people who do this for a living, and they tell me, that is they organize political campaigns for a living. They get people elected. If somebody walks up to them on election day and asks them if there's an election that day, they'll say, "I don't know." Why is that? Because they don't know how that person's going to vote. Now, so this is the thing. So political parties are an infrastructure. They're an organization. And I think that's the thing, is that what you're seeing is you've seen one that's simply done a much better job, in part because it was captured by a social movement in the 1960s and 70s called conservatism. So the Republican Party in the 1970s, or beginning in the late 60s and 70s, became a much more ideologically homogenous party. Because otherwise, what parties have been in the United States is they're groups of factions. Parties are factions. Think a bag of cats. That's what political parties are in the United States. Prior to the 1965, actually after Goldwater lost, the Republican Party became a party that had one huge cat and one very small cat called liberal, or what they used to call Rockefeller Republicanism. And that huge cat just slowly killed off the smaller one. And by 1978, 1980, you just had one cat. And on the other side, yeah. And on the other side, so it became much more ideologically cohesive and much more organizationally cohesive. Alternatively, on the other side, the Democratic Party remains the quote-unquote federated type of weak parties that most other countries in the world would look at and say is not a political party, because it barely has any structure. We all know the famous quote, I'm a Democrat, I'm not part of any organized group, therefore I'm a Democrat, right? But I think that's the thing. Is it so? In some respects, polarization is problematic, but it's also an infrastructure. It reflects institutional practices that are used to mobilize people in a political system where very few people vote. Very few people.
Thank you. Yeah.
So this is going to sound kind of funny because in a way it's the problem, but I do think that we have to stop demonizing government. That's one of the other things that's been demonized in our culture. And I sort of lay a lot of it at the feet of Ronald Reagan because he sort of developed it to a high art before he was president. But people like other institutions in the society, large companies, arts organizations, the media. We've been talking about some of these organizations throughout this evening. Government has a role. And I think one of the issues that we see in the polarization is that one of the political parties believes that government can be a force and a useful tool for helping solve some of the human problems and the economic problems we encounter. And another party thinks the government perhaps has a very limited, if any, role in that regard. And so when the parties try to get together to do something in the government and the Congress, these very differing visions of what should happen really impede any possibility of moving forward. So, my favorite example, the current example, of course, is what's happened on the Affordable Care Act, right? That the Democrats thought that they had made the big compromise because the structure of the statute is built on a Republican idea, which the Republicans have now backed away from. And the Republicans refused to negotiate about how it might actually be implemented at the time of its passage. Then there were the refusals of some states to adopt the Medicaid expansion, leaving millions without health care coverage. I'm never quite sure how that has worked as a political strategy, but nevertheless, it seems not to have cost to date, although that seems to be changing the Republican Party too much. Then there were the refusals to correct some of the flaws in the Affordable Care Act. In the old days, there would have been a technical corrections bill that would have obviated the need for at least one of the cases that went to the Supreme Court. There are some, it's not a perfect statute. No statute like that ever is. But with some fine tuning, it could work better and be more effective in actually helping people get health insurance. No collaboration on doing anything about that. And then Trump is elected, and he begins undermining the implementation. So I see just this whole series of efforts to really undermine the notion that government can have a positive role in solving any of these problems, and that we need to actually get beyond that if we are going to make any progress in eliminating the polarization. Bless you.
So, in your book, you make a number of suggestions for how the Democrats could mobilize politically to cut across the divide. And for the benefit of the members of the audience, I'll just who haven't read the book, I'll mention some of them. But your main point is to look for more universalistic policies that could apply to all Americans, not just segments that can then be identified as part of identity politics, right? So you mentioned things like comprehensive health insurance, a basic income, family leave policies, subsidized daycare, pre-kindergarten. You also mentioned labor market policies such as more extensive job training, wage subsidies to train workers, work-study programs for high school and college students, mobility allowances for displaced workers. The thing that concerns me, though, is the success of the hyper-divisiveness in America. I mean, we did have Arlie Hochschild here, and it strikes me that many Americans who are currently voting for Trump are voting for identity reasons, and they will let that trump, literally, anything else. And therefore, I'm not sure how that's going to be a successful strategy. And secondly, I just have a question for you, which is, given that one party is by far and away the aggressor in destroying the soft guardrails, the political norms, and by doing so, ensuring a lock on power through gerrymandering, voter suppression, which has been turned into a real art to lock in majorities. How can an opposition respond to that without further exacerbating the divisiveness? Because what you're accusing them of is undermining a Republican form of government, not in the large R, the small r sense. So it is a betrayal of what this country is meant to be. How can one say that without being divisive?
Thank you very much. So for the sake of time, I want to now open the discussion to the audience, and I would like to invite Daniel to join the panelists. I have received dozens of questions, trying to go quickly through them, and they keep on coming. Unfortunately, there's no way that we're going to be able, this is the stack that I have, that we're going to go through them. So I'm going to ask the first question, and I ask please the panelists, maybe just one or two of you, if you can answer the question so that hopefully we have more of an opportunity to cover more questions. So I got a question here that is, is the United States decline in democracy not the result more of in an oligarchy among the wealthiest rather than an autocratic regime? So why is it that the U.S. is not more of an oligarchy rather than an autocratic regime? And what role, if any, has the United States military foreign policy played on the decline of democracy?
I'm happy to comment on at least the first half of the question.
Okay.
One of the underpinnings of the book is that, what was the answer? That the ballot box is the precursor to new leadership. I think it's before the ballot box. And so I believe that the failure of business and government to respond to, for example, the 2008 financial collapse, the extraordinary cost of health care, the impact of technology on jobs, those are the socioeconomic conditions that give rise to these authoritarian leaders, because they see this fracture in the promise of America and the reality of how we live. And so I strongly believe that if you look at Hitler, you look at Trump too, people didn't feel that. I'll give you an example. A colleague of mine who's an attorney in Detroit, and he's 70. He said, Richard, my classmates who finished high school with me went to work in the automotive companies. They had great jobs, they had great pensions, they're retired, they send their kids to school and they have pensions, and I'm still working. That reality doesn't exist anymore. Those people cannot finish high school and have a job for life. So I believe this gap between the wealth of our society and the average person and the distance between it is a fundamental threat to democracy. And I blame the business community as well as the political community for not understanding its impact.
Yes. Yeah. So I'd just echo something about that. One of the most striking figures, if I had PowerPoint, I'll just draw it for you in the air. You can imagine this, which is, imagine a figure in which you look at productivity gains every year from 1945 to 2016 in the United States. You see this line kind of going up like this, like the economy is getting more productive at all times. And you look then on this same figure, there's a line for average wage gains for the average worker, perfectly parallel to that line, going up. Suddenly in 1981, 82, the line begins to flatten. And basically it's been a flat line since 1981, 82, average wage gains for the average worker. And so the point is, it's hard to imagine. So what this in effect indicates is people aren't necessarily sure that their children are going to have a better life than themselves.
They don't.
And so as we've tended to think that rich countries don't have experience democratic breakdown, again, as I said at the beginning, I mean, that's something there's a lot of evidence of that. But one of the reasons maybe that wealthy countries don't have democratic breakdowns is that things are getting better for most people. But if that's no longer the case, then the question is, for the first time in 100 years, this is no longer the case. Can we rely on that correlation between national wealth buying us democratic stability? I mean, I question that.
Can I follow that up and ask a question? So you're a comparative political scientist. Those same trends in the development of productivity compared to wages, that's not just an American thing, right? Absolutely. But it is an American thing that in the age of Reagan, it flatlines for working Americans. I don't know the answer to this, but I suspect that in places like Sweden and Germany and others, those lines are much closer. So what happened? Why were they able to maintain that when we were not? And I just put it to you that it's still the devil's bargain of the fractured American we, which is that in America, racial status trumps economic well-being because white Americans cannot imagine other people who are in their position suffering as they are as part of the same body politic. And therefore they cannot unite to come up with solutions, and that leaves them vulnerable to being captured by an autocrat like Trump and something like the Southern strategy, which speaks either directly or indirectly to racial anxiety.
Yeah, so just to answer the question, I mean, that it is true that you have similar patterns in West European countries, but they came later. They came really beginning in the 1990s. The U.S. was a kind of canary in the coal mine for this trend. And why? So you see similar figures I've seen in Germany beginning in the late 1990s. All of this is rooted in a certain global economic reality, which is that economies stopped growing so fast after the early 1970s. And so we're kind of coping with how to deal with that basic reality. I sometimes, and I think it's that combined with an increasingly diverse population that makes such a potentially potent mix, because it's easy to play demagogic populist politics when you have both a slowing economy and an increasingly diverse population. And so I sometimes imagine to yourself, so between 1945 and 1973, I mean, you had basically a period of uninterrupted economic growth in the United States. Imagine if the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act had passed in 1948 instead of 1965. You would have had 40 years of an institutionalization of American democracy in a period of high economic growth. Instead, we had a kind of experienced an unfortunate accident of history that these reforms didn't happen until the 1960s. And totally unrelated to this, the global economic oil shocks and so on, the economy began to slow. And so it's this combination of these two big macro trends that's made the U.S. vulnerable. But I think, this makes it sound very kind of deterministic. I think there are policies to kind of take the rough edges off these things.
Yes, so these policies, can I just add something to that? These policies that Greg was alluding to before, so I'm actually on sabbatical this semester, and one of my projects for the sabbatical is working in Washington several days a week for an organization called the National Academy of Social Insurance. And I'm not going to make this a commercial about that, but it's it's basically a think tank on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, health insurance, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, and we actually have a paper that we hope to finish before I have to come back in January on universal basic income or assured income. And we don't make proposals and recommendations, we just analyze different options that are out in the world that one might think about how to structure these programs. So the infrastructure exists in the United States on everything except for assured basic income. Infrastructure is starting to be developed on family leave policies, support for caregivers and the families who have to use paid caregivers. States are starting to do a lot of interesting experimentation in all of this. And so the the ideas are there, but it's really a question of will to commit to them so that we can, that people have this level of economic security so that they feel like they can participate in the political process, so that they have confidence that the bottom isn't going to fall out from under them in the world because of, declines in productivity or the oil crisis or, some climate change disaster. So it's there, but we really have to commit to making them work more effectively for people in this country, I think.
Okay. I have a question from the audience. Do you see anyone, Republican or Democrat, who is working to preserve norms?
I think
It was an intentional question. Eh?
yeah. I mean, I think that the Democratic Party leadership, congressional leadership, has been remarkably restrained. So Nancy Pelosi has been very clear that she's under. I think the Democratic Party leadership is under enormous pressure from angry voters, probably lots of people in this room, who sort of say, take a stand, like, go after this guy. But I think they actually, I think, wisely showing forbearance of saying we're not going to pursue impeachment unless wait till the Mueller report comes. We're going to wait till the Mueller report and look at the Mueller report. I mean, it would be very tempting to not do this. And, there's guys like Michael Avenatti who are out there, saying we need to fight hard and act like tough guys. And, that's appeal. And again, I can understand the visceral appeal of that. But I think the Democratic Party leadership, and, I think the Judicial Committee, if you look at the Judiciary Committee over the Kavanaugh hearings, I think the Judiciary Committee they didn't have many options. I mean, you could ask them, like, what constitutional hardball options could have they used? They could have not showed up to the hearings, perhaps, but they didn't. They sat there and participated in the hearings. They asked rough questions, but that's the process. They voted no. That's part of the process. So I think, in a way, I think the Democratic Party leadership has showed remarkable self-restraint, and in that sense is trying its best to reinforce norms. I think I think President Bush, actually, during the Bush years, I didn't vote for President Bush. I was not a fan of President Bush during the Bush years, but I think during the Bush years, President Bush, in retrospect, he had 90% approval ratings. He could have done anything he wanted with 90% approval ratings after September 11th. And, he did do lots of bad things, but he did not, he treated his political rivals with some degree of respect. And, you ask yourself, if President Trump had 90% approval ratings, what would the world look like? So I think, in fact, I think that we have to give recognition that there are political actors on both sides. I think in the current context, the Republican Congress has performed abysmally, though.
So I just, maybe a sports analogy is helpful here, because, I too am tempted to, retaliate in kind, for all of the insults. But if you think about, watching the Sunday, football games and the Saturday college games, right? The player who draws the penalty is the one who retaliates. The ref never sees the original infraction, but the ref always manages to see the retaliation. And I think that that's the risk that Democrats run into here, because the public has forgotten about Merrick Garland and how norm-breaking that whole situation was. So to, do things that were more extraordinary than what they did during the Kavanaugh proceedings, I think would have been very problematic, because the public would not have felt that it was justified.
Another question. The focus of the book is on elite behavior, leading to democratic backsliding via norm erosion. The focus of solution is also on elites. What is the role for mass publics in both the decline and the potential fix?
I guess I can respond to that. So I think that that's actually fundamentally one of the challenges that the authors recognize in the book, going right back to the founding fathers, right? They're talking about that you need these gatekeepers. Firstly, it was the Electoral College, then it was the parties, then they talk about the famous rooms in the back, cigar-filled rooms in Chicago, where all these people were being essentially selected. But it raises the populist kind of dilemma. Well, firstly, think about populism. Number one, what does it mean? How is it defined now? It's like no one really knows. And it's also the question of what are the pros and cons of it? Because the sense is, that there is the space between something that's quote unquote populist that you think is favorable and positive, and something that is essentially mob rule or a majoritarian will that's systematically kind of represses any kind of minority opinion is quite narrow. So even though like ideologically we often say, and I think this is one of the things that they point out in the book, right, that both on the left and the right political traditions in the world have invoked the idea of the masses, but that can become kind of like a mob relatively quickly.
What I've been excited about this year has been the number of new people standing for election, particularly women. And I think that the best way to express your discontent, the best way to get involved in addition to voting, is standing for public office. I mean, that's what this country is all about. I was very, very involved with a recent campaign. City Councilor Ayanna Pressley ran against a 20-year incumbent on the congressional side. And when she spoke to me very early on about thinking about running, I said, well, tell me why you want to run. One of the data points that she pointed out to me was that 1 in every 4 voters blanked this incumbent, meaning they went to the polls, but because he was disengaged, they didn't vote for him. So that suggested that even someone sitting in office was disengaged, and she beat him by 18 points. So stand for office, start young, run for something at Suffolk, lead your club. We have campaign school. Who's our professor who runs campaign school? You run that?
Yes, I do.
You and who else?
Professor Cobb, myself and Professor Cobb.
Professor Rachel Cobb. They run campaign school. Run for public office.
So there's one other group that is commonly not recognized that is actually trying to enforce norms, and those are the career employees of the government. Now, there is the whole deep state criticism, and I'm not quite sure, and this was written by a political employee about that New York Times op-ed, about, controlling things and slowing down the president. But the political employees, the career employees, really do try to keep things running as they always have been running. Obey the law, enforce the law, implement the laws that Congress have passed, and that we actually as a country should respect them for that, because I think that is really a crucial aspect of our system.
Which is why if the Republicans win in November, I think we can expect large purges of civil service after November.
I don't know about purges. There will be some voluntary departures, that's for sure. The civil service rules do actually make it quite a little bit difficult to accomplish the purges. But after...
you can make life miserable.
You can. And after Bush was elected the second time in 2004, a lot of the career people that I worked with left the government at that point because they just couldn't do another 4 years of it. So that does happen.
Yeah, talking about turnout and what people can do. One thing that other countries have, Australia, other countries, is mandatory voting. And I'm not, that's sort of to think about like how one implements that and so on is hard to imagine in the U.S., but that's something worth thinking about because it requires people to vote. And you then get people to vote who normally aren't voting, and you can imagine the whole politics then can be arranged as a result of that. But I really like this point about career civil servants, but I would even broaden it to say I think that what something people can do in their daily lives without even realizing is, I think the professions more generally. People operate in their daily lives, if you work, by a professional code, whether you're a member of the Bar Association or any profession that you're part of, there's an set of ethical guidelines that guide your behavior, and going to work every day and doing your job and not giving into pressure of corruption. Journalists, I think civil servants, military officials, lawyers abide by a kind of professional code that I think helps protect our democracy. And if people don't give in to the kind of pressure and it can latch on to their kind of professional ethical codes, this can actually bolster our democracy. And I think you've seen this with journalists and across all walks of life.
And if I may add one comment to that, I think something important that is mentioned in the book, but that we see it all the time, is we need to engage from people that think differently than us. I mean, one of the major problems that we see today is that we reinforce our own views, our own ideas, our own politics, because all we do is read, watch TV, follow social media from people that think like us. I think if we want to build bridges, if we want to build consensus, it's important that we reach across the aisle. There's another question here. To what extent the threat to democracy lies in its failure to enact the policies reflective of population aspirations, rather than those of competing factions of economic elites exercising their influence on other political elites?
Yeah, one of the things I want to mention was Nate Cohen, who works for the New York Times Upshot. He made an argument that a significant number, if you look, for example, in Michigan, 4.6 million people roughly voted in Michigan in 2016. Right. Trump won by about 12,000. So if you look at across the quote-unquote Brexit states, as people refer to them, right, the Midwest, the about 70, 50 to 80,000 roughly where it's decisive. And I think what Cohen makes the argument is that what Trump did to Clinton in 2016 was what Obama did to Romney in 2012. He made her appear as the elite Wall Street outsourcer who was not responding to their economic reality. But what Cohen argues is that Obama did that in 2012 to Romney and got a lot of these people to vote for him in 2012. So it goes back to the idea that if the Democratic Party, I think one of the fundamental mistakes and failures of the Democratic Party in 2016 was what was its economic message? And if you read Trump's speeches or listen to them, he appropriated a lot of rhetoric from the Occupy movement. And saying that this was a global elite, obviously it kind of got into some inflammatory stuff that the Occupy didn't, but it was this transnational corporate elite that the Clintons are part of, and that were captured by Wall Street, and that they represent. That's what they represent. And so I think that was, for a number of people, they were like, well, I don't know, maybe they're right.
And to your same point, though, we're going to face that same issue now. You can't. We learned that you can't run against Trump. You can't say, I'm not Trump, so elect me. That's essentially what Hillary did. You got to have a plan and a program. And so the party's got to find leadership with a plan and a program that resonates to the public. Yeah. You just can't say, hasn't this been awful? Haven't you had enough?
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's not going to do it.
Well, one of the problems we haven't really talked about is the fake news and disinformation problem. It's discussed in the book, the misrepresentations and lying that go on. Now, there's always, spin in politics. It tries to make, the silk purse out of the sow's ear and all of that, all of those old expressions. But and I apologize for all the healthcare things, but this is what I do, so this is what I follow. But yesterday President Trump published an op-ed in USA Today. Basically it was a scare op-ed about how the Democrats are going to ruin Medicare for you by these proposals for Medicare for all. You can read that, and then you can read the Washington Post fact check on it today. But he's basically making all these promises about, protecting people with pre-existing conditions, protecting choice in healthcare providers, which no one has now anyway. All of this stuff that is a scare tactic, but has no basis in actually the delivery of actual healthcare. And it's not representative of what the Republicans have wanted to do, which is to replace Medicare with vouchers. He makes it sound like the Republicans are in favor of continuing Medicare and making it better. It's not clear that that's the case. He's proposed and supported legislation to eliminate the protections for people in the insurance markets with pre-existing conditions and things like this. So there needs to be some ability to communicate to the public about what's accurate and what's not in the political discourse, I think.
Yeah, can I follow up on that point? I think one of the things that I've discovered, and this is not in our book, but there's a kind of interesting little story. In the 1930s, there was these psychologists and sociologists who were worried about propaganda, and funded by Filene's of the Filene store that's no longer here. they set up an institute, the Institute for Propaganda Analysis, in which they developed elementary school curriculum to train children to immunize them from the appeals of fascist and communist propaganda. And this was implemented by different states across different, and so actually the thing that brought my attention to this, my father, who grew up in Maine, could still recite, 60, 70, 80 years later, the 5 hallmarks of propaganda. I mean, so these guys developed a very effective method of communicating but it's pretty smart stuff, and so, but this, and kind of interesting, sad twist to the story is that once they were successful at this, then they decided they needed to train school children to immunize them against the appeals of Madison Avenue and marketing. And it turned out some of these guys were socialists, and so during the 1950s, this kind of came under, and a lot of this stuff got disbanded. But the broader point, though, for our purposes, that I think is interesting is the idea of civics education, and and that's sort of like civics education doesn't sound exciting, but in fact I think it's potentially very promising kind of way of training children in particular and citizens to deal with the media environment in sophisticated ways. And I think we're only in the beginning stages of this. This is work that both sociologists, psychologists are increasingly interested in, and there's lots of kind of initiatives underway to try to figure out what are things that we can do to train citizens, and to not just assume that, in a way it's taking our democracy for granted, to just assume we can have the free flow of information and don't have to sort of prepare ourselves to deal with this environment. I'm all in favor of the free flow of information, but that this doesn't mean that we don't need to prepare ourselves for it. And so I think training citizens and school children to deal with this is really critical.
The book is a comparative book, and there are examples of many other countries. There is one question specifically focused on that. So, other than Venezuela, I think all of the examples that you gave of authoritarian regimes are right-wing regimes. Is there a reason that authoritarian methods are used more by right-wings?
I guess that's a question for me, huh?
I guess.
Well, I don't know if Erdogan in Turkey counts as a right-wing. He's ambiguous. I mean, I think the thing that they have in common is that they are outsiders, and these guys often have little political experience and come into office and are quickly overwhelmed. So this is not just Donald Trump. I mean, I think in Peru there was a similar. We tell the story of a Peruvian president who wanted to get nominated for the Senate, but nobody would nominate him, so he decided he'd start his own party, and in order to get attention would run for president, and then became president. And so these are outsiders, and then once in office don't know how to deal with the onslaught and use out inflammatory rhetoric, then are perceived by the establishment as being threats, which they probably are, and then the kind of spiral begins. So I think that's the big part of it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you're right, though. I guess tends to be on the right. I mean, I think, the ideology of people matters. I mean, do you have a commitment to liberal democracy? And I guess historically in the 19th century, I mean, I've written a book on conservative parties and democracy in which I make the case that conservative parties actually made an incredible contribution to democracy. But the push for democracy came from the left historically. It was workers' parties demanding the right to vote and demanding the expansion of the suffrage. But I have a book on conservative parties, and the point of the conservative, you have to, you can't wish away conservatives, but the question is, what kind of conservatives do you have? Do you have conservatives in certain countries in Europe that embrace democracy, or do you have conservatives who turn against democracy? And I think that's, so conservatives play an important role as well.
Sebastian, I was going to say very quickly, there is a distinctive kind of Marxian tradition where people have interpreted how Marx responded and analyzed the Paris Commune in the 1870s, which basically, when the French, they captured everyone, they just executed people. They didn't take any prisoners at all. And there was a distinct Marxian tradition that basically said that shows you what will happen if you get captured by the bourgeoisie, so you have to eliminate the bourgeoisie. I mean, that's basically the terms of the deal. So you could see this in a lot of the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. There was definitely this sense that you have to capture the state and then you have to use it as a vehicle for overt political violence. And I think that was one of the things that led to the tradition of like Stalinism and things like that. So unfortunately, I think on that side there was that quote-unquote rich history of...
There are exceptional questions, and I'm so sorry that we don't have time to go through them. Have the final one. A lot of the questions have to do with elitism and institutions and the role of civil society. This question says, American democracy has historically excluded specific communities from the political system. So why should we, as engaged citizens, care about preserving these institutions? Why not develop new systems that truly are inclusive of our communities? I thought it was a good question.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, there's an argument out there, which is that, norms of hierarchy are worth eliminating, and I agree with that. I think, not all norms are good. Just because we've had norms in the past doesn't mean they're good. But I do, so norms of hierarchy, norms of repression, norms that justify hierarchy and repression of racial hierarchy, these obviously need to be eliminated. And these obviously are counter to democracy. But I think if we look at the content of the norms, the norm of mutual toleration, which is the norm that you essentially accept your rival, you can't have a democracy without it. And so, I think it's worth preserving these norms and, preserving the institutions. I'm not sure when somebody says eliminate the institutions, I'm not sure, like the institution of voting, the institution of the House of Representatives. I think there's certain institutions somebody brought up the Electoral College that one could kind of revisit. There's lots of things but I think we have to have a basic sort of baseline against which we measure our institutions, which is a kind of commitment to the basic values of democracy. And so, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I guess that's my short answer.
Any other?
I would just add that one of the things, for example, that Ayanna Pressley did is she hired a multicultural media team and took ads out in Portuguese, down in Chinatown, in Latino community, and pushed those voters to the polls. And so it's just basic politics. You got to look at the demographics of the electorate today. It's changing. And if you are an incumbent and you don't make a transition, you got a problem. But it represents a great opportunity for new elected officials.
Mm-hmm. So, but that example also raises another interesting point. It's unlikely, and I think she agreed with this, that she would vote differently in the Congress. I'm not saying she doesn't represent a lot of valuable and important principles, but that her vote in the Congress is probably not going to be a lot different than her predecessors was. So
we can discuss that, but go ahead.
Yeah, well, anyway, because I have a story to tell about that too. So, the hour is late, but
right.
I do. But the example is that the book talks a lot about race, and that's the exclusionary practices and how a lot of the political accommodation was built on excluding people of different races who were not white. But it was also built on excluding women, which I think was also a factor in, I agree with the comments about the nature of the Democrats' campaign in 2016, but we have not dealt adequately with the full incorporation of women in our political culture either.
I agree with that.
You're here.
Gotta run.
Thank you. So with this, I remember when I was reading the book and reading so much about what is happening today, it reminds me to a famous quote from William Faulkner. And he said, "The past is not dead, it's not even past." So I think as you reflect on what we're seeing through the wall and the historical context in which the book framed it, I think that quote is more relevant today than ever. But I want to end on a positive note, and a quote from mentioning President Abraham Lincoln and making the reference that we hope that our countries will rediscover their better angels, but also let's remember, all of us, the collective responsibility that we all have to make sure not only that our democracies don't die, but our democracies will flourish. So thank you so much, all of you. Thank you.